Promises of far-reaching democracy in states previously characterized by widespread disenfranchisement, political repression, and vivid class distinctions have been a feature of revolutionary ideologies throughout history. In the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, these promises were a crucial element of revolutionary rhetoric and policy plans, garnering these causes large support bases and strong ideological identities. Although these two revolutions subscribed to different schools of thought, with the French Revolution being based in liberal thought and the Bolshevik Russian Revolution subscribing to Marxist-Leninism, each identified democracy as a fundamental goal of their respective movements. However, in both of these cases, these progressive promises were undermined by periods of intense, violent repression, state terrorism, enacted by the very revolutionaries who had advocated for freedom and democracy only years and months prior. This presentation will explore the relationship between these promises of freedom and the disquieting reality of state terrorism. However, it will not argue that state terrorism was the inevitable cynical outcome of a co-opted movement, nor an unforeseeable practice in either of these cases. Rather, I will argue that state terrorism was adopted in these cases to, quote, protect, to limited degrees of success, the democratic promises made by their perpetrators. This practice was contingent and improvised. However, it had roots in the violent leadership cultures of these states prior to revolution. Therefore, in seeking to explain the relationship between dictatorship and democracy in these cases, I will argue that repressive authoritarianism was rhetorically and logistically justified by both the French and the Russian governments during the French Reign of Terror and the Bolshevik Red Terror, as a tool to ensure the protection and preservation of democracy as a contingent outcome of the accumulation of threats to both regimes. I will explore these justifications in detail, exploring Maximilien Robespierre's report upon the principles of political morality and the Council of People's Commissars, or CPC's, decree on Red Terror as primary sources which provide justifications and directives for terror. This exhibition draws on Tackett and Livesey's respective works on the contingent nature of the Reign of Terror, and Whitewood and Ryan's argument that the Bolshevik Red Terror, which subsequently created a culture of violent, repressive government in the USSR, was a dynamic response to perceived threats to power consolidation in the post-revolutionary period. This presentation will cover each of these periods in the overarching framework seen here, outlining the different phases that can be identified as governments journey from successfully achieving revolution to eventually adopting terrorism. The first phase is concerned with the conditions that encouraged a revolution and the nature of political cultures prior to revolution. For example, in both of these cases, disenfranchisement was a common feature, but brutal repression was more cogent with czarist and provisional government administrations in Russia than the ancien or old regime in France. The implications of this will be discussed later. The second phase is immediately post-revolution and sees the making of promises of democracy and freedom to the public. And the last phase tracks each government's eventual adoption of state terrorism as a response to mounting internal and external pressures. This crucially demonstrates my argument that the adoption of terror is circumstantial and contextualized by conflict and pressure, rather than being an inevitable outcome of any revolution. Phase 1, pre-revolutionary conditions. Pre-revolution, both the Russian and French governments had lost the support of large portions of the population through a combination of factors. In France, we can discuss two key pre-republic stages, the last days of the Ancien regime and the subsequent implementation of a constitutional monarchy. The French monarchy's financial support for American revolutionaries had created a debt problem which could not be responded to with tax revenue raised by current regulations. Additionally, wheat prices had risen considerably between 1780 and 1789. The estate system saw massive disparities in the taxes required from the third estate, who were paying proportionately more, and the other estates, while they still enjoyed fewer civil and economic rights. The economic mismanagement, poor political health, and overall disillusionment with the Ancien regime led to the calling of the Estates General in 1789. Enlightenment thought, specifically the promotion of liberal democratic ideals, inalienable rights and freedoms, and constitutional constraints on monarchy, saw the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen, as well as the passage of the August Decree on Feudalism. McPhee argues that these documents, quote, represented both the repudiation of the old order and a statement of intent for the future, end quote. This statement of intent was for a constitutional monarchy. However, this system was itself rife with administrative and ideological issues, such as a massive lack of support from the church. Louis XVI's household's flight to Varennes and the subsequent abolition of the monarchy created another host of problems for the new regime to tackle, particularly as they attempted to reconcile these challenges with the liberal democratic promises they had continually made to the public. These promises and these challenges will be discussed later as precursors to and contingent causes of the Reign of Terror. In Russia, we can also observe two phases: the dying moments of the Tsarist regime and the short-lived rule of the provisional government. Tsarist rule in Russia had long been characterized by widespread disenfranchisement and brutal repression, which Williams argues was perceived by the Tsar and his advisors as a mechanism by which they could, quote, face, end quote, the limitations of constitutional rule even after 1905. This culture of political repression and violence continued after the end of Tsarist rule in Russia. The provisional government's use of violence and imprisonment to respond to the July Days uprising was simply a diluted continuation of this political culture. However, this repression, in the face of vocal support for a Bolshevik government, was badly received by the public. Swain argues that the Russian public was concerned that the government was beginning to, quote, chip away at the achievements of the revolution, end quote. This general disillusionment was imbued with a growing conceptualization of political rights and freedoms, particularly in the workplace, which some legislation was perceived to limit. Lenin, in fact, argued that political and democratic freedoms were crucial to securing the consciousness and the liberation of the working class, stating that, quote, freedom of the press, association, assembly, and strikes are indeed absolutely necessary for the workers, but precisely in order to implement those freedoms, we must understand the inseparable connection between them and the general foundations of political freedom, between them and a radical change in the entire political system. Thus, the Marxist-Leninist ideological basis for the October Revolution was already laid in political discontent with the provisional government. Phase 2, democratic promises. Both new governments, the government of the First Republic and of the Russian Republic, promised democratic and political freedoms premised on an ideological support for democracy immediately after victory. In France, the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment framed such promises. The adoption of inalienable rights for the male population in the form of the Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen included rights to suffrage, fair trial, and the freedom of expression and religion. The liberal underpinnings for the revolution itself cannot be overstated. These ideas framed the logic of the revolutionary government. Terror did not feature as a part of this ideology or of these promises. In Russia, universal suffrage for both men and women had been granted in 1917. The democratic promises made by the Bolsheviks were more concerned with granting workers control over their workplaces and giving them the capacity to collectivize. Additionally, the Bolsheviks offered individuals freedom of association and the freedom to strike. Given that these promises were not made within the logic of liberalism, but rather within a Marxist-Leninist approach to democracy, it is extremely important to note that the Russian Revolution's democratic promise was not inherently liberal nor rights-based. Phase 3, adopting state terrorism. In both states, mounting pressures saw a shift away from the ideological promises made immediately after victory. This highlights the contingent nature of these policies, where seemingly existential threats encourage leaders to consolidate their power through violent means. In France, the Declaration of Pillnitz, which outlined the threat of war with Prussia, in addition to a perceived faltering in revolutionary fervor in favor of factionalism, led leaders such as Robespierre to advocate for policies of terror. Tackett here highlights that suspicion of conspiracies among leaders actually predated revolutionaries. Rather, there was a dominant culture of, quote, conspiracy obsession, end quote, which was co-opted by the architects of terror to inflate fear and revolutionary fervor. This can be observed in Robespierre's report on political morality, in which terror is justified as an expression of, quote, virtue and loyalty to the cause of liberalism. This legitimizes terror as an appropriate and necessary ideological response to a great existential threat. The Reign of Terror itself was characterized by extreme violence and extrajudicial killings. thus breaking the rights to freedom of speech and trial acknowledged previously. Giraud argues that such expressions of terror are inevitable betrayals of revolutionary ideals. However, the mounting international pressures on France and the chaotic nature of the terror itself, from its initial legislation to the height of its implementation, support Tackett and Livesey's claims that terror was instead a largely improvisational result of myriad internal and external pressures on the new French state. In Russia, the threat of civil war was imminent. The White Armies, comprised primarily of counter-revolutionaries, loyal monarchists, and foreign allies, presented an existential threat to Bolshevik power consolidation and government. Additionally, the Bolsheviks had come to power through armed insurrection, rather than the relatively more stable process by which a constitutional monarchy transitioned to a republic in France, and this made the need to consolidate power all the more glaring. And finally, Russia had an administrative and political culture that was rife with violence and repression. Novikova notes that this culture caused individual participants in violence to emotionally internalize and thus retributively enact the violence they experienced, but that this violence was elastic in terms of allegiance. Therefore, it was important for the Bolshevik government to utilize this violence in favor of the Red Terror rather than the White. The CPC's decree on Red Terror highlights these threats, particularly in framing them as existential. The need to publish the names and offences of executed individuals in particular demonstrates the adoption of an ideological warfare framework. Ryan argues that such frameworks acted as rhetorically, quote, purifying such violence and rendering it sacred, end quote, ultimately creating a political religion through which state violence could be justified as a purifying act. The Red Terror, which lasted throughout the Civil War period, was also characterized by frequent extrajudicial killings, mundane violence, in which peasants killed other peasants or otherwise participated, and the long-term repression of political freedoms. Crucially, this culture of repressive violence persisted throughout the 20th century, finding its basis in this very process of sacralization. The shared characteristics of these terrors, their violence, their justifications within a democratic framework, despite violating the previous conditions of that framework, leads us to one crucial historiographical conclusion. That is, the relationship between dictatorship and democracy in these cases was fluid and contingent, and democracy was both a cause and a justification for repression. It was fluid because states shifted between democratic and authoritarian policies continuously, with justifications for authoritarianism being rooted in democratic ideals, thus illustrating how democracy can influence dictatorship and vice versa. It was contingent because both the Bolsheviks and the Committee of Public Safety were threatened by counter-revolutionaries, war, and challenges from other revolutionary parties, and implemented state terrorism to respond to these threats, rather than as designed or inherent parts of the revolutionary process. And this rejects previous historiographical approaches to these events, such as that taken up by Giraud, which view these as inevitable outcomes in which the relationship between democracy and dictatorship is a one-way street. The fluidity demonstrated in these instances rebuts this completely. Additionally, it is reductive to assume that democracy and dictatorship cannot inform each other or communicate. Rather, they justify and beget each other in both of these instances, as I have just proven.